1917 sees the Great War continue to roll ever onwards. The Germans, having been pushed back in the aftermaths of the battles of Verdun and the Somme in 1916, think of what their next move will be. Meanwhile, General Robert Nivelle has already decided the Entente Army's next move. He envisions tanks and infantry assaulting the slopes of the Chemin Danes. Once they have broken through, his cavalry divisions will circle north and link up with the British Army's salient. If all is successful, the offensive will encircle roughly a third of the German forces on the Western Front. As planning for the offensive took shape in the winter of 1917, the Germans made their own plans to actually retreat to more heavily defended positions. This would be a risky move, as the Army's assets wouldn't be able to assist the retreating German infantry, leaving the stretched German line vulnerable to the Entente forces. But if successful, the German line would be shortened and forces could be more concentrated to repel similar offensives the Entente had successfully performed the year before. The 88th Senegalese Infantry Battalion reflected the state of the French army, formed from various other Senegalese battalions that were under strength, and supplemented with new French West Africans. The unit was founded on paper on the 16th of December, 1916. The veterans had seen service at Verdun, and those that had served thus far were considered highly able by their own battalion and the French army staff. While named and based in Senegalese, the men could actually vary from France's various West African colonies. Oftentimes they had their own wives and children back at camp. The French army staff was split on this non-traditional arrangement, but the typical Senegalese infantryman on a whole was less likely to be put out of action due to venereal diseases compared to those of the typical other French or French colonial troops. The 88th Senegalese Infantry Battalion was part of the French 10th Colonial Infantry Division, which had been engaged with the British during the Battle of the Somme. The division boasted various French colonial units from all over Africa, the 88th being the newest formed addition to the division. The division was placed in the French 6th Army of the Reserve Army Group. All throughout winter, various French staff officers and Nivelle were creating this new army group for the upcoming spring offensive. It is at this time when the French are gathering their forces that the Germans retreat to the Siegfried Line, a network of well-prepared lines of defense. This catches the Entente completely by surprise, as the Germans control the air, and thus the Entente didn't find out about the retreat until after its completion. This stretches the Entente line. Nivelle asks if the British can capture Vimy Ridge, so that his French forces won't take enfilade artillery fire from the north. The Battle of Vimy Ridge takes place a week before Nivelle wants to launch his own offensive. The battle gives the Entente a false sense of superiority, as the Canadians that attack Vimy Ridge surprise both army staffs. In less than 4 days, the Canadians have captured all their objectives and pushed the Germans back. This is a double-edged sword. The Germans will have less elevated artillery to fire on Nivelle's offensive, but this also shortens the German line once again, allowing the Germans to reinforce the Chemin Danes with more artillery assets and aircraft patrols. As the Canadians take Vimy Ridge and the Germans move more men to the Chemin Danes, the French move their forces into position to assault. As the French 10th Colonial Division prepared for the assault, one of the colonels in the division's staff is killed inspecting the front on the 4th of April, 1917. While the Canadians had been practicing at the corps level before their assault on Vimy Ridge, the unit diary of the 88th states that they simply rested till the 10th of April, 1917, when they entered the French trench line. French artillery fired over 500 shells per minute on the Germans on the 12th of April, 1917. Contrary to many writers, the Senegalese weren't planned to be used as cannon fodder. The first wave, which they did not take part in, was supposed to advance around 19 kilometers to Léon, past the Chemin Danes. The second wave, of which the 88th Senegalese Infantry Battalion was part of, was to secure the first wave's lines of communication and supplies. Thus, the popular notion that Senegalese were only intended to be used as melee shock troops with their iconic chop-chop machetes is a myth. The French infantry's first wave in the morning dark stand to assault at 0330 on the 16th of April, 1917. At 0600, they go over the top. The French with ease capture the German first line on the slopes, which was a wreck of its former self. The artillery had done its job. When they reformed to assault the German second line, though, the assault met disaster. Hidden tunnels in the Chemin des Danes let the Germans reoccupy machine gun nest positions the French thought secure. As the French attempted to assault the summit under machine gun fire from the rear, the overhanging German defenders rained bullets on the Frenchmen. Contrary to the picture of mud on the Western Front, the ground was actually dry, soft, fine dirt. This slowed each man's uphill climb in the loose dirt. Some of the French were able to find shelter for a few moments in the tunnels below the slopes, but these were also laden with German defenders that were waiting for the French. Only now, as the sky began to snow, was the second wave called up. The French 10th Colonial Infantry Division, men of the 88th Senegalese Infantry Battalion, assaulted up the soft soil slopes. Suffering as much as their white comrades, they made it to the summit and the trench full of Germans. Only now, with their famous chop-chops, the 88th cleaved a way for the rest of the division and the French to flow over the summit. The Germans in the tunnels attempted to counterattack the French colonials, but with grenades and hand-to-hand fighting caused the Germans captured below to surrender. They will hold the summit without rest or reinforcements in the snow against German artillery barrages and infantry counterattacks for the next 4 days. The attack that was supposed to be completed in a 24-hour operation had now dragged on. Unlike many other units, the 88th was given leave to rest at Bièvres on the 22nd of April, 1917. The unit commanding officer had survived the ordeal, but the unit was a shell of its former self. On the 5th of May, the unit will be folded in with a French White Metropolitan Unit to reinforce the 58th Mixed Colonial Infantry Regiment. The offensive was a strategic failure. Nivelle and many of the French Army staff officers would be replaced. Very few would see combat command again, and many of those not till 1918. Complacency and too many aggravating factors made it impossible for most French units to feasibly obtain their objectives. The offensive did capture ground. The French 6th Army took over 12 kilometers, and the Germans lost a comparable number to that of the French casualties. But Nivelle's vision of decimating the German army's center had failed. That summer, further major French operations were cancelled as mutinies began to break out amongst the French frontline units. Despite these setbacks and difficulties, the Senegalese would continue to do good work, striking fear in the Germans and inspiring the French people to win the First World War. Whenever the fighting began to get difficult, they chopped it.